Welcome to the Uncover podcast. My name is Andy Coleman and I'm joined with my co-host, Joanna.
This is a podcast exploring Jesus, the man who claimed to be God, and we're specifically looking through the eyewitness accounts that you see in Luke's gospel and the natural topics and questions that come up from that. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Matt Lillicrap, former doctor turned pastor and now director of UCCF, the Christian Unions. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Matt, we're going to jump pretty much straight into the podcast. I'm going to start with a big question. Why should we actually care about who Jesus is? Why is this a topic worth talking about?
It's good to start with the first huge question. Undeniably, Jesus is just an enormous historical figure, a giant of history. Probably the single most influential figure in history, certainly as far as Western culture is concerned, but arguably in terms of history, full stop. In the West, we even set our calendars by his birth, and he has been undeniably influential to almost every strand of Western culture and significantly across global cultures in many ways as well. And so for us living in the UK, if we want to understand the world we live in, and the culture we live in, we can't avoid the person of Jesus. Whatever it is we think of him, we can't avoid him. He is present in so many different places. So that would be the first reason why bother with him culturally. He's just enormously significant. You can't escape him. Second, though, I think would probably be that there are unique claims made about him, which Luke's gospel, which we're talking about, make very clear.
Can you give us, I guess, an example on both of those things? So you're talking about, okay, culture shaped by Jesus, by this person. Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So the way in which Western culture has developed with so many different values, which we take for granted as embedded into our society, embedded into the way that we think and the way that we act towards one another, have their roots really in the way that the Christian faith, which centered around Jesus Christ, obviously developed from those beginnings in the 2,000 years ago around his birth in the first century, and then his life and his death and the claims of his resurrection. And as that culture has developed and various different teachings of Christianity that center in on Jesus about how we should care for one another, how we should treat one another with respect and dignity. The idea that that every single human is simply born with universal rights. All of those would have been totally alien in the culture that Jesus was born into, the Roman culture, the pre-Christian world, but has come rooted out of Christianity, out of the teachings of Christ, and out of the way that he fulfills, as Luke would say it, all of the teachings that went before him in the Hebrew Bible. So I think it's some of the most fundamental values we have in our culture, right down to you have a right for me to treat you as an equal human being with value and dignity, are rooted in the historical figure of Jesus.
Yeah, so similar to where even you don't have to be a Christian necessarily to be shaped by Christianity, in the same way that I've heard somewhere recently that Richard Dawkins says, yeah, I'm a cultural Christian. And I don't know, I've seen that plastered around, almost trying to mock Richard Dawkins a wee bit. I don't want to talk about him too much. But yeah, you got that idea of actually being Western British, you shaped by Christianity.
Yes, it's inescapable. I mean, we sit in Oxford. It's even there right in our architecture and the city that we are around. You can't explain the architecture of Oxford University without understanding that its roots are in the idea of the sacred, and the fact that the university is a sacred place of learning. You would be able to explain even the very architecture of the city that we're in without understanding something of those values. Whether you hold to them yourself or not, they're there even in the very stone, the fabric of the city we're walking around.
We could jump back a little bit. What is it that you mean when talking about Jesus? Because Jesus, he's a pretty divisive character. People have different views. I've had conversations with different people about who Jesus is, and then we'll think of it saying that we're talking about the same thing, but then actually we're talking about very, very different things. How would you describe who Jesus is?
Oh, there are so many different ways to answer that question. I think in the end, there is one place to start, which you would want to start with any figure of history, which is the records we have about it. And the primary records we have about Jesus are the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke being the one that we're thinking about today. So really the first answer for that question, who is this Jesus, is, well, he's the Jesus who's described in these four accounts of his life and his death, and then the claim of his resurrection is so famous. And so really that's the first place to start. What is it that is actually said about him? Who is he depicted to be in these earliest written accounts of him? And it's important to say that like any other document that's describing a character, they're written in a sense, with an agenda of wanting to be persuasive about something. Luke immediately starts with saying he wants his readers to be confident of the things they've been told about Jesus, which he then goes on to unfold. So he's writing with a desire to build up confidence that Jesus is a significant person. For Luke, it seems someone of cosmic significance, whom he is thoroughly convinced has turned the world the right way up, and has done that in a fulfillment of thousands and thousands of years of promises, and even of the whole flow of history itself. This idea of fulfillment in Luke is so significant for him.
I think the difference that I feel like a lot of people maybe don't understand or realize is you'll get a lot of mythical gods or creatures that have impacted moral compasses around the world, and Jesus can be easily thrown into that category. How would you say he's different than all of those that we've seen before?
That's a fantastic question. I think C.S. Lewis wonderfully is a wonderful phrase where he talks about the Jesus story being myth become fact. And that's such a powerful phrase, because it recognizes that there are common strands with some of those ideas of kind of myth and legend that develop kind of into values and meaning. And that's not something we should shy away from when we meet Jesus. Like those things are there, those elements are there, but they are those elements are being brought down into the flesh and blood reality of history itself. As myth become fact, in that he is a historical figure who can be encountered like any other historical figure, and that's where there is a significant point of difference. Luke isn't sat alone coming up with some idea of who Jesus might be. He's someone who spends time actually going and encountering people who met Jesus face to face and hearing the stories of what happened when those people did meet him. It goes from person to person to person asking those stories, and that's what he's written up. Rather than a sort of some kind of story that he's either come up with himself or that he's built on from tradition. He's actually got people in front of him, flesh and blood people, that he can speak to about what happened.
So Matt, you're not just talking about like this philosophy or this theology, because we talk about Christianity, we can kind of get lost into a headspace of a religious conversation that a lot of people just might not be there. But when you're talking about Jesus, you're not necessarily talking about religion. You're talking about a person, someone that we can read, someone that we can encounter, meet.
Right. We're so used to these kind of conversations about truths and about ideas being in that sort of realm of ideas, and sort of the intangible, the abstract, the stuff that we can't touch, we can't feel. When Lewis describes Jesus as myth become fact, what he's saying is that those abstract ideas have become flesh and blood. Mm-hmm. That's the idea. And therefore, when we are meeting Jesus, we are meeting somebody who can be encountered as a person, not as just a series of ideas which might might influence the way we live our lives or something like that, but as a person that we will relate to in a relationship, and that we can meet him in the pages of Luke's gospel, and encounter him and be influenced by him. And that's a massive point of difference to sort of the sort of philosophies or world ideas that we might be thinking about.
What myth? Like myth become fact? Like what do you mean when talking about the myth? Or what does C.S. Lewis mean?
That's a great question. I think in those terms, Lewis is essentially using the term myth as a kind of catch-all idea for the big values that we might kind of live our lives by, and particularly the idea of a creator God, a God who is there in some form. So he's using the term in those ways, and then he's saying that sort of myth that would take in all sorts of different things. In the ancient world, it would have been a pantheon of gods. It could be all sorts of different ideas of the divine or of the spiritual. In the 21st century, very often, it would be the idea of just the spiritual realm, that we are spiritual beings, that there is something more to this world than just what we can see or feel and touch. That's a sense of something that we have. And Lewis is saying that sense of something can be accounted as a someone in Jesus.
I think it's so exciting, the concept of a story almost coming to life in that sense. And like all the other myths and things that you would read, although they are real and they apply and you can fit them into your life pretty well, it's interesting that you say you can encounter Jesus through reading that. How is that different than any other story? Because I feel like whenever I'm reading a story, although I feel it's very real and applicable, I wouldn't say it comes to life. Would you say it does?
I suppose that sometimes we can have experiences reading a story that powerfully touches us, can't we? In different ways. Yeah. But where we're encountering Luke's gospel and the accounts of Jesus, it's not just that we're encountering a powerful story, we're encountering a person who actually acted in these ways, that actually encountered these people and turned their lives and the world in which they lived the right way up, in so many different ways. And Luke seems to focus very, very strongly on those meetings. There is a number of stories which are shared between Matthew and Mark and Luke and John about Jesus, but they each have their unique perspective, just as any storyteller would of any event that they'd seen themselves. A journalist might, of any event they've seen themselves. And one of the unique perspectives that Luke seems to be focused on is the watching Jesus encounter people and what effect that has. It seems to me that he's a man who is convinced Jesus has turned his world the right way out. And now he's showing how he has done that in so many different encounters through his life.
Do you want to give us an example? I feel like I might ask that question a few times. Yeah, can you give us an example within Luke's gospel of how like someone's encountered Jesus and has actually done that? Like what has that looked like?
So one of my absolute standout favorite stories within the bigger story of Luke would be a tiny little story which is even sandwiched in between a bigger one. There's a story of a religious ruler, something like a cross between kind of a local MP and a local vicar or bishop, kind of comes like both rolled into one, comes to Jesus. He has a 12-year-old daughter who, in the culture of the day, that means a coming of age daughter, just about like all the potential in the world. She's his daughter of a great person in the local community. He comes, she's dying. He falls at Jesus' feet and begs him, please, can you do something? And by this point in Luke, we're sort of 8 chapters into Luke's gospel, Jesus has already got a reputation because he's been doing all sorts of amazing things in the story of Luke. It's been healing people with a word. It's been doing amazing things. So if we're in the story, there's no doubt we know Jesus can do something. And so he goes, he says he's going to go. But the story that really stands out to me is what happens next, which is the story of another person, another female, an older woman. And Luke is a physician as far as we know. He's a doctor, a first century equivalent of a hospital doctor. And he mentions this woman has a condition that no doctor's been able to cure. And it seems it's a gynecological condition. And again, in the context of the day, this woman is carrying in her body a deep shame, to the degree that her condition would have separated her, or should have separated by convention, should have separated her from the society around her. But Luke describes her and almost kind of gets us to watch her and edging through a packed throng towards Jesus, trying to touch him, which again, by convention of the day, would have been unthinkable for her with her condition to touch a religious leader like Jesus, a rabbi. But what she does, she gets to him, she touches him, and according to Luke, she is immediately healed and immediately starts to edge away back through the crowd. But the thing that changes the story, the thing that it turns on, is that Jesus won't let her go. He calls her he says, "Who touched me? Someone's touched me." In the middle of a crowd, there's disciples themselves. I'm like, everyone's touched me. He draws her in and eventually has her, again, fall on her knees before him at his feet. There's only two people in the whole of Luke's story who fall on their knees at Jesus' feet. This religious leader and then this woman. These two stories are intertwined. And it turns out this woman who's had 12 years of bleeding, the same as the age of a young daughter, with so much potential, that has already apparently snuffed out all of her potential, is now face to face with Jesus, probably burning with the shame of what she has carried for 12 years, but also what she's just done, touching this religious leader.
What would you expect to happen next?
Everything you'd expect would be that she would be rebuked. Everything you'd expect would be, I'm sure that's what she would have expected her. Yeah. And certainly in that culture and at that time, she shouldn't have been in the crowd and she shouldn't have touched Jesus. You'd expect her to have been rebuked. But that's not what Jesus does. Instead, he says, "Daughter." That's how he addresses her. In the middle of a story in which we're already seeing Jesus on his way to heal one daughter with all her potential, he now takes this older woman whose potential has all been snuffed out, all but been snuffed out by all that she's experienced for 12 years. No opportunities for jobs, no opportunity for marriage, no opportunity for children, and calls her daughter, and then sends her on her way. And I think it's watching Jesus encounter a woman who carries a deep, deep sense of hidden shame in her body, which is an experience that so many have today. And seeing him not just meet that shame, but actually remove it is so compelling. And Luke gives us these little vignettes, these little encounters with Jesus, almost as though to say, what does it mean for you to encounter this same Jesus? What shame, what secret shame might you carry that he might bear and take away? And it's just a deeply compelling person.
I think that reflects the Jesus that a lot of people describe across the world. I'm sure Matt and Andy, you can probably relate to that in some way, knowing him already. But is there a specific time you can think of where that story or any other story in Luke's gospel that has the same narrative has touched you?
I think for me, I encountered Luke's gospel from quite a young age. I grew up in and around church and so familiar with the Bible, but really a lot of the time for me felt like the Bible was this sort of dead kind of old text, and that Jesus was a figure a little bit like the kind of the myth in some way, something akin to the Tooth Fairy in my life. And I can remember being given a copy of the Gospels together, but directed towards Luke, precisely for the reason that there were these very, very vivid encounters with Jesus. And I had described myself as feeling a little bit like my encounters with some of the accounts of Jesus' life had been so analytical. I'd done GCSE at school and had been given these stories about Jesus, and it was a bit like we'd sort of pinned them to a board and dissected them like a frog and just left them lifeless. But when I read that story And then the other stories where Jesus encounters people with similar shames in different ways. I suddenly found myself thinking that, wait, this is me. There are all sorts of things in me that sort of little shames that I carry, sometimes deeper, sometimes less. And that Jesus is meeting these people there. One would be one of the most famous, again, stories of Jesus encountering someone would have been the story of Zacchaeus, short man, and maybe even the archetypal short, angry man. He's a tax collector. He's literally a traitor to his own people, raising money for the occupying forces who are responsible for kind of crucifying people who aren't part of their culture and society in thousands.
That's not painting a picture of a good man.
No, it's not someone you want to hang out with. And there in Luke chapter 19, he's up a tree because he's so short he can't see Jesus, but something draws him towards Jesus, even though he's a total outcast in his culture. A traitor in his culture is an absolute traitor, right? He's essentially, he is funding the people who have kind of done the legal occupation and abuse of his next door neighbors. That's essentially what he's in. It's not just a tax collector. That's his role. He's not just a tax collector like we would think. We don't like people taking on taxes. No, he's a traitor to his next door neighbors and to his family. So outcasts, and Jesus says, I want to come to you now.
And Jesus, again, to add in more context to this, Jesus being a Jew being occupied by Rome. So that it's not just like, it's more personal, isn't it? It's more personal and personal to Jesus. Like Jesus is someone that's being oppressed by Zacchaeus.
Exactly. It's not just his next door neighbors that he's a traitor to, it's Jesus himself. Yeah. Jesus is one of those people that he is now raising money from in order to pay for the army that's occupying their land. It feels horrendous to them. And you can almost read it within the narrative as Luke tells a story. You can almost feel the crowd indignant. Why would Jesus want to go with him? He's supposed to be a respectable religious leader. This man is a traitor and an outcast, making himself rich off the back of being a traitor. And yet Jesus comes to him and says, I won't come to your house for dinner. And in the culture of the day, to go to show hospitality and to receive hospitality from someone's house is one of the most honoring things. I mean, it's still an honoring thing to do for us, but we perhaps lost just how honoring that is. Jesus is honoring Zacchaeus by doing that, even though everybody would say he is not worthy of any honor at all. And the response, it is a complete rebirth. Zacchaeus is transformed by his encounter with Jesus. Yeah. Rather than seeking to put himself first, rather than seeking to raise his own riches, he's going to try and seek to meet the needs of others. Yeah. And Jesus' summary is incredible. He's invited himself over to his house. He said, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house. And then using a word which is so key in Luke, he then says, salvation's come to this house. There's something about Jesus that brings salvation to the most broken of places. The deepest of shames, whether it's a hidden shame or even a slightly respectable looking, making myself rich kind of a shame. And that was so enthralling to me as I read that as a teenager.
I'm going to ask as a teenager, how old we? I think I must have been about 15, 16 years old.
16.
Yeah,
Social anxious, awkward.
Feel ashamed of me saying. Absolutely. Yeah. Always aware that I was carrying something around that felt like everybody could see, but I knew no one really could, but I knew it was there, like in all sorts of different things.
And it, like, again, being a teenager, you carry like an inner angst, and you just like, you always got a bit of inner angst, and you always want to try to fit in. You're always trying to be invisible. Or not necessarily invisible, but you're trying to blend in and be cool with everyone else. Not necessarily trying to be who you are. Then in this story with Jesus, he looks upon someone that is obviously an outsider, someone that is actually like probably hated, and then he turns to him.
Yes, and then it repeated over and over and over again. I mean, the story of the woman is one, the story of Zacchaeus is another, but there are tens and tens of these stories again and again and again through Luke's gospel. Jesus is meeting people where they are and calling them as they are, and bringing them into a place of belonging, into a place of relationship with him. And then most deeply of all, and this is where the biggest claim of all comes, saying that he can put their relationship with the divine, with God himself right. And that's what's bound up in that word of salvation.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much more to unpack with that. We'll see how we go, because someone might be listening to this podcast so far and they're like, okay, you kind of get the sense that Jesus he's a real person, he's a historical figure, shaped the values that we hold today. So, you're talking about this idea of grace towards an outsider or someone that is lowly and offering healing, forgiveness, those types of values of loving thy neighbor, treating people as you want to be treated, that type of thing. We can kind of work through that. We can kind of understand that. Okay, you got a historical person, you got good values that I want to aspire to be. And then you got making right with God. God comes in the picture. You open pretty much the first few pages of Luke's gospel and you got an angel talking to a virgin, and then out pops Jesus as claiming to be God, and then you got miracles, then you got demon possession. Like, how do you and again, you're a trained medic, a clever person, intellectual maybe. How do you rationalize these ideas? How do you make this idea of God? Like, 'cause you might just switch off. You might just be like, okay, I don't know how to have a framework to understand Jesus as God, spirituality, angels, demons, miracles, healings. Like, that's just not real. What would you say?
I think, there's so much I could say. I think the first thing is to acknowledge something is really important, what you've said, which is that we have this kind of, this book that Luke has written, from the very, very first words. It's very clear that Luke is writing something which has got a whole load of prehistory to it. Like a whole load of kind of there's a set of assumptions, but there's a narrative in which even that sits. Because Luke's first words are, I'm kind of wanting to show the things that have been fulfilled among us. And that idea of things being fulfilled in this story of Jesus is that he's saying that there's something of, his claim is that there is something of cosmic significance which is coming to fruition in Jesus, which is what goes way before and beyond Jesus' own kind of earthly life of 30 plus years. Something much, much deeper and longer than that. So it's right to say that there is something more happening there, and that there's a level in which we sort of immediately plunged into this world where suddenly, it's not just argued for, but it's assumed that God exists and that he interacts with his world. And we can't escape that.
Is that in the time of Luke's gospel, or is that across history, all time?
You mean in terms of the kind of what it means for God to have interacted with?
Yeah, and almost the assumption that God exists, the assumption that God does exist. I don't know if that's necessarily when I was at school. That wasn't the assumption.
It's there for Luke. That's the important thing. Is that as he writes, he's writing with a set of assumptions that he's building on, that God exists and interacts with his world. Not only that he has also indicated that he has plans, and that's what's kind of, that word fulfilled is so pregnant with meaning, because it suggests that there's an intentionality to something that's going on here. Then that perhaps that idea of intentionality is perhaps where I'd start to be able to just start to kind of press the idea that we live in a world in which we function as though there is an intentionality, as though things are headed somewhere. Even where we might articulate with our mouths saying, in the end, it's not headed anywhere, it's meaningless. We live a life where we set ourselves according to certain directions. So we live in a world that seems to carry intentionality within it in so many different ways, whether you're looking into the way that creation itself is structured,
And the amount of times we'll use the word this such as designed. I remember my medical lecturers repeatedly telling me that the human body is designed to do this or this or this. That word design assumes an intention. Yep. Or even just the way that I plan my own life and think about my future. I want to aspire to do this or this. That's my intention, but it's set within a broader idea that that such a thing exists, that the world carries intention within it. And as soon as we're starting to talk about a world where there is intention, we're starting to ask questions about where does that intention come from? Where does the idea that there is a intention essentially demands a personality? If we're living in a world where we are essentially assuming that there's such a thing, and it's not such a huge leap to say that personality with intention is someone who could communicate with us. And that's the assumption that it makes, is that personality is called God, that he can and does communicate with us, and that he does that most ultimately in the person of Jesus.
So Matt, just trying to understand this and coming back to the C.S. Lewis quote you mentioned before of myth becoming fact. So with the intention, the design, almost the meaning, like the values that we hold that are really important, that we want to say are true, but we can't actually provide a basis for, myths becoming fact, becoming true in Jesus. And almost say, is that kind of what you're saying? Would you agree with that?
I think so. Yes, I think that's what he's saying. I guess the idea with myth for C.S. Lewis is what is it? The things, the narratives, the ideas, the stories that drive us, from which we derive our values, from which we derive our understanding of who we are, our identity, and then make decisions on how we ought to live. I think there was there's an ethicist who said we can't make any decisions on how we ought to live until we understand the story of which we're a part. The sense of we all know the pitfalls of main character syndrome, where we have a friend who always is making themselves. It's all about them. But there is a reality in which we are all characters in one another's stories. What does that mean? If we're all characters in one another's stories, does that mean we're all characters in a big story? In Luke, we get to find out the answer to that question is yes, and begin to make sense of how that big story works, in which we can find our place and be found, just as those characters that we mentioned, the Zacchaeus and the woman, are found by Jesus.
I think it's the myth part and the becoming real kind of thing that is so well displayed in Luke, with the different characters throughout as well. Although they all have the same kind of, Jesus shows the same love to these people. Yeah. They're all different people. Yeah. And I think it's really good to see how he can meet each person individually. And I think all three of us sitting here would have a completely different experience, even different stages of life, would have come to faith at different points. And I think all of these stories represent each of us sat here right now, I think. And I'm sure people listening can probably place themselves in these stories. And I think it's just amazing to see how Jesus does meet each individual in such a specific way.
Because you're talking about, going back to the idea of Jesus as a person. Yes. And then each one of us has different relationships with each other. And then Jesus has this relationship with you. And you're talking about in your shame, so almost like in the deepest part of yourself, Jesus is able to come into that and almost call you out of that. For me, when I was at university myself, going back too many years, that I like to admit, I was longing, so I wasn't a Christian, longing for the sense of meaning. I went through like a nihilism stage of like, woe is me, everything's meaningless, life's pointless. And I was like, what's the point? I just got like, what's the point? But I knew that there had to be one. And then it's come a little bit full circle, because I came to a Christian Union event, asked to read John's gospel, so John's account of Jesus. And then it was able to kind of bring color to my life. This idea that there is a story, there is a plan, there is purpose, there's meaning, there's a sense of light. And I was invited into that. There was that sense, what you said, Matt, of, Jesus meeting another woman at a well. This is going, it's going John's gospel, rather than focusing on Luke. But Jesus meeting a woman at the well who was thirsty. And Jesus says, I can give you living water. And that sense of like, I realized I was so thirsty. There was some part of me that was just really, really longing. Then Jesus clearly had that invitation for me, being like, come and drink.
And I think what you were saying, Joe, the way in which Luke in particular brings this idea of this sort of these values, these ideas that have been expressed sometimes by human story writing, but he brings that, he roots that in not just a story that humans have written, but a story that humans have watched in the life of Jesus. Right from the very first pages, you mentioned, Andy, that you encounter angels straight away. Yeah. And it's like, what's going on? But you don't just encounter angels. You encounter angels in the middle of a specific time of Roman history. Luke immediately says this happened whilst this guy was on the throne, or just while this was happening. There's 2 or 3 points at the very early pages of his story. He roots things in this is happening right then, at this point in a physical time in history. And so you sort of get this coming together of these two things, the coming together of the flesh and blood grounded nature of this is happening whilst there's a Roman emperor and there's a Roman governor in this part of the Middle East, and it's happening in this specific place in this specific time. Luke is writing as somebody who knows the terrain, knows the places. It's very clear from the way that he writes. And yet at the same time, it's this incredible bringing together, meeting, kind of fulfillment of all of our longings, all of our desires to see the shames that we carry, the things that we wish weren't true about ourselves, put right. All of our desires for some understanding that there's something more to the world than just what I can see and touch and feeling, a kind of real longing, our desire for a belonging and then a genuine home. All of this sort of comes through in Jesus, in the physical flesh and blood, grounded, kind of dust on his sandals, real dust that actually existed in the Roman Empire in the Middle East. That's what's so wonderful about reading Luke.
Yeah, I think that's another way it becomes real as well, is like we can imagine, a Roman world, like it sounds almost mythical in itself, but that is at one point someone's local hometown and just a day in time and an angel appeared. And I think to really think of it like that is so real. Just because it was so long ago doesn't mean that it's any less real for that time period. And I think even just to place it into your local town or where you are currently in your life, if an angel appeared, I think you'd kind of stop and think.
Has there been any example of that, do you think, have you had any stories of, I guess, like encountering the supernatural today? What would you say?
I think certainly, yes, I think. But I think one of the most, perhaps it's seemingly ordinary ways in which, this is the thing that's disarming about the Jesus story, is that it can seem so ordinary. One of my, a friend would say that they absolutely encountered Jesus by opening up Luke and reading that story of the woman that I mentioned earlier. She herself would have been somebody who has, through all sorts of different things that in her past that have both been done to her and then by her, carried far more shame than average, and would have never felt able to see herself lifting her eyes face to face with a fellow human being. Particularly, she was constantly somebody who would always lower her eyes, let alone the idea that she might stand before a God who made her, who because he made her must be good and perfect, and whatever. That's how she always conceived, having never been to church in her life. And through her later teenage years, spiraled into deeper and deeper and deeper crises, trying to kind of numb away all of the things that happened to her in her past. And she would say that she encounters that idea of the supernatural and the person of God himself in Jesus, the man who is God. As she read that story, And as she heard Jesus say, "Daughter, your faith has saved you," she would say she heard Jesus say that to her. And so much of her history was bound up with a father who did not treat her as a father should. To hear Jesus say, "Daughter, your faith has saved you," was utterly transformative, and overnight transformative for her life. And the wonder is, this is rooted in something that happened, and someone who is real, and someone who can be encountered. And perhaps before we don't say this, someone who is living now. There's the big, why should you bother with Jesus in Luke question. Because by the end of Luke's gospel, it turns out that Jesus has conquered death itself.
That's the big claim, isn't it? That is probably the biggest claim. Jesus conquered death itself, and I guess what will make sense to us, we're talking about Jesus encountering people, Zacchaeus, and the woman, and Jesus still encounters people today through these different stories. It's not necessarily an encounter with the story; it's still an encounter with Jesus. Jesus is still living today. That's the claim. Why should you bother listening about Jesus? That's probably the reason.
Yeah, ultimately, there is no bigger reason than that. And some might say, well, isn't that just a fantastical claim?
It sounds a bit fantastical, doesn't it? Yeah.
completely like, oh, why should I even bother? Because it's too fantastical.
Yeah.
It's almost too good to be true.
Yeah. Because
every single one of us, whether we have yet or it will happen, we will be touched by death. It's inescapable. In the Western world, we are privileged that we have to live as long as we sometimes do in order to experience death actually encroach in our lives. In the majority world, that would be within your first 2 or 3 years of your life in many ways. But we are somewhat insulated from that. I'm very, very aware of the way that, when I was working as a doctor, death becomes a clinical reality. We hide away behind hospital curtains and clinical washed hospital doors. But it's a reality we can't ultimately escape. And it's a reality that the story of Jesus in Luke says, Jesus, not only did he willingly not escape it, he willingly walked into it. He then walked through it. And possibly one of the most amazing and perhaps even funniest parts of all of literature is watching Jesus encounter. Luke tell a story of Jesus encountering 2 of his friends after he had died, whilst they are the last thing they expect is that they're going to encounter Jesus because he died. And they are talking about all the things that have happened. Of course they are. They're devastated. They had pinned their hopes on him. They're talking about all that's happened, and Jesus comes and joins the conversation. It's a classic moment of, well, hang on a minute, do you not realize who you're talking to? And it's worth reading. Almost worth reading simply because of the way the story is told, let alone what the story is about, which is this ultimate idea that inescapable reality can actually be escaped of death because Jesus has done that for us.
And what do you think is the key reason for why he needed to come back to life? I think everyone knows he died and he rose again, whether they believe it or not. The rose again bit can sometimes be brushed over as like, that's just what happened next, but that should definitely not have happened in most stories. So why was it important that he did
Sorry,
come
Joanna.
back? No, not at all.
You almost got the big ending, isn't it? Is the sacrifice. I watched. I don't know when this is going to go out, but Squid Game, the final season, you got the big sacrifice at the end. And it's in. I don't know if you've seen Squid Game season 3, but you get this. Yeah, I know. You get this moment. You get this moment though of this big sacrifice, and that is so powerful. If you know anything about Squid Game, so powerful. It turns everyone away, and that's how the story ends.
Right.
Not how this story ends.
Not this one.
And that's that. It's not that it reduces the power of the sacrifice. It turns the power of the sacrifice all the way up, maximizes the volume on it, because it does 2 things. First, it says that the sacrifice did something. It accomplished something. The sacrifice of Jesus, according to Luke, is all the way through Luke. Jesus keeps on saying to people, Your faith has saved you. Something has saved you. Again and again and again. And it's a hard thing for us to hear, because the idea that we need saving suggests that there's something that we need saving from. And the more and more that the story unfolds, it seems to be clear that Jesus is saying we need saving from the brokenness of the world, yes. The shame that can be imposed on us by what's been done to us, yes. But then actually the brokenness within, the shame within, all the things that we have done that have built that up in us, that we know we haven't measured up, even to our own standards of how we ought to have lived, whatever that means in our heads. And that Jesus goes willingly to death in order to sacrifice on our behalf, that he might put right the relationship with God, is an astonishing thing. The thing that makes it wonderful is the resurrection, the idea that he rose to life again to show that new life, that new way of living is now available for us. That we can live in relationship with him alive. That does sound fantastical, because it is fantastic. Yeah.
And grounded in history. We can point back and say it happened. Our world has been shaped by it. We're at 2025. What's the AD mean?
AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord, is since the time of Jesus' birth. Yeah.
So like our timeline's been shaped by this man. I know what BC means, before Christ. I think that's easy. You got that aspect. So like our history's been shaped by this.
Yeah.
Then it feels fantastical. It seems crazy. It seems a little bit crazy. But then we can't escape it, because it's shaped. It's in our past.
It's in our past. And here's the thing that's really fascinating. Just to get, this is a slight side point, but we spend a lot of time trying to pretend our history isn't shaped by this. Even to the point that now, some of my kids at school are taught that they don't use BC and AD. They use BCE and AC, before the Common Era and after the Common Era. And because we don't want to be sort of offensive by saying that this is just about Jesus. And it's an ironic attempt to kind of say, well, the calendar isn't focused around his birth. Because of course it still is, because what is it that makes the difference between the Common Era starting before the Common Era and after the Common Era? What event is it that triggers that change? What happened 2025 years ago? Indeed. Even when we attempt to sort of kind of brush over that, we can't. It's embedded into history itself and the way that our whole culture thinks about the world, because it is such a powerful story. And the fact that Luke's gospel takes us as this powerful story, which is powerful enough to shape the whole way you think about the structure of history itself, is rooted in history itself, is actually something which happened. You can see, almost picture Luke. I said earlier on, he was a first century doctor. You can picture him almost right with the stethoscope around his neck, going from person to person with his notes, taking the history. As a doctor, you take a patient's history. You ask them, what's happened? What's the history of what's happened? Tell me your past medical history and all of this kind of thing. And he's taking the history of the encounter with Jesus. Okay, so tell me what happened. What was it like when you met him? And that's what Luke sets out to do. It turns out that this story that has the power to change even the way we number our calendar is not just a story. It's a history with profound significance.
Yeah, so I think going back on to what you were saying about the death of Jesus, and also even links back to the whole thing becoming real again. I think personally, in my own experience, discovering that this was a real event and that this happened, combining that fact with the personal impact that has had on my own life, and only really something that could be fully understood and brought to me by God personally. I think he showed me this himself, that this sacrifice is what shapes everything in our personal lives as well as history. And I think understanding the actual meaning of it, not just the words that are said. At school, you're taught Jesus died for your sins and that we're forgiven, but understanding on a personal level that everything that we do in day-to-day life is completely shaped by this event in time, and that unlike a lot of other religions or faiths, you're reaching for something constantly, and you're living as if you're aiming to get to a certain point or do a certain amount of things to get there. But this is a completely different story in the fact that we've had this accomplished for us in history before we were even born or even thought about, or just thousands of years ago. This event happened, and we can now live off the back of that. And that is such a freeing thing to have that spurring us on. I think that does really differentiate us from so many other people, that is our
It's sort of the opposite, isn't it? Of
100%.
Of the idea that we've got to try and reach ourselves up to God. Here is Luke telling us this Jesus is the man who is God. He is God putting on flesh and blood, coming to us, reaching down to us, rather than us having to reach up somehow to him through whatever way that be.
And his words on the cross as well. It is finished. It's done. That is all that needs to happen. And it can be hard to understand. We like naturally as humans, you're always wanting to do better, and you're constantly thinking. It's hard to relax into that idea that this is it and that it is finished. But that is the beauty of this story, definitely, that this event shaped history, but it shapes our lives today, definitely.
Yeah. And I think playing off that, I know for me personally, I want to try and hide my shame from everyone and not release any of it, and kind of put on a face, do my hair in the morning, look good, trying to be someone that I want to be. But then these stories encountering Jesus, he kind of looks through that, he looks past that, he sees you in your shame, and he still calls you, he still says daughter or son in my case.
Is worth investigating for all of these reasons, and probably 1,000 more. We could do another 3 or 4 episodes of a podcast on why he's worth it and why he's worth picking up, uncover, and seeing what we make of it.
And I think that is the invitation, isn't it, that we have. So, we shared about people's encountering Jesus and saying Jesus is still alive to be encountered today. And the way we do that is kind of reading about him. What we know is kind of recorded by Luke from these stories, then they're kept for us to be able to read today. And so if you listen to the conversation and you're thinking, this feels so far-fetched or fantastical, I guess the invitation is to see for yourself. See for yourself who Jesus is. And I guess that is the main point. Why bother looking about Jesus? Because he has shaped our world. And then there's the invitation to see for yourself who he is. Is he a man who really is God? And kind of encounter him through Uncover Luke. Read it with a friend, read it with your Christian union. The invitation's there. Best case scenario, Matt, Joanna, what will be the best case scenario?
Well, I think it's quite a thing that you can read something like this and read it again and again, and at a certain point it all kind of becomes real or makes sense to you. And I think that is something that you have to explore yourself, and you hopefully my ideal outcome would be that moment would come, that you would read Uncover Luke or look in or any book in the Bible, and that you see that what we're talking about here is not just an idea or a historical event, that it can actually have an impact on each and every individual to this day.
Worst case scenario of picking up Luke's Gospel, Uncover Luke?
You'll know a little bit more about what he wrote and about this book that has been part of, it's one of the 66 books of the Bible, which has shaped so much of the culture in which we live in the UK. And that's probably the worst case scenario.
I guess you're at uni, just become more intellectual. You just know more information. That's probably the worst case scenario. Great. We'll wrap this up. But Matt, we've asked you quite a lot of questions today. What is one question that you want us and our listeners to kind of leave with and ponder through?
I think we talked a lot about the sort of longings and ideas and things in that sort of world of myth. And then we've talked about a little about the kind of history, and suggested that Luke is making a case that those two things come together. I think maybe the question I'd probably leave is, have you ever found yourself, even in kind of fleeting moments, longing that there might be something more than you see or touch? Have you ever found that question just weeding its way into your mind in the middle of the night, in a conversation with a friend, maybe at a low ebb, maybe at a high ebb? I think that'd probably be a big question. If so, well, uncovers the next place to go.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it is something that you have to see for yourself. So if you would like to get hold of a copy of Uncover Luke, you can reach out to your local universities, and the Christian unions there would love to lend you a copy. You can have one for yourself. But it's been a great episode. Thank you, Matt, for everything. And thank you, Andy. And we'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.
Goodbye.